The mansion in the hills of Culiacan overlooked the sprawling city below like a fortress watching over its kingdom. From my bedroom window, I could see the red-tiled roofs stretching toward the Sierra Madre Mountains, their peaks catching the morning light like broken glass. This was my world, beautiful, isolated, and built on blood money that flowed through Sinaloa like the very rivers that carved these valleys. My name is Maria Elena, and for 15 years, I was married to one of the most feared men in the Sinaloa cartel. Diego wasn't just any sicario or plaza boss. He controlled trafficking routes from Mazatlan to the border, commanded respect in Badiraguato where El Chapo once walked freely, and had enough power to make politicians in Hermosillo tremble when his name was whispered. But to me, in those early years, he was simply the man who showered me with emerald jewelry from Colombia and promised me the world. We met in Guadalajara when I was barely 22, working as a secretary in a law firm that, I later learned, laundered money for various criminal organizations. Diego walked into that office wearing a perfectly tailored suit, his eyes dark as obsidian, carrying himself with the confidence of a man who had never heard the word no and meant it. He courted me like a gentleman. Flowers every day, dinners at the finest restaurants in Zona Rosa, weekend trips to Puerto Vallarta where we stayed in penthouses that cost more than most people's annual salaries. I knew something wasn't quite right about Diego's import-export business, but I was young and naive, intoxicated by the luxury and attention. When he proposed after 6 months, presenting me with a diamond ring that could have fed a small village for years, I said yes without hesitation. Our wedding was a spectacle that made the society pages of every newspaper in western Mexico. 500 guests, a reception at the most exclusive hotel in Guadalajara, and enough flowers to perfume the entire district of Zapopan. The first few years of marriage were like living in a golden dream. We moved to the mansion in Culiacan, where I became the perfect cartel wife, beautiful, silent, and willfully blind to the source of our wealth. I spent my days shopping in the exclusive boutiques of Zona Dorada, lunching with other wives who lived similar lives of luxurious denial, and redecorating our home with art pieces that cost more than most people would see in a lifetime. The servants called me Señora with genuine respect mixed with fear, and I told myself this was love, not terror. But luxury cannot insulate you from reality forever, and in Sinaloa, reality has a way of seeping through even the thickest walls. I began to notice things, the late-night phone calls that sent Diego racing into the darkness, the way conversations stopped when I entered a room, the armed guards who appeared and disappeared like shadows. Our beautiful home became a prison with golden bars, and I was its most pampered prisoner, living in comfort but never truly free to leave, to question, or to escape the growing darkness that surrounded us like the desert winds that swept down from the mountains. The illusion shattered completely on a Tuesday morning in February, 3 years into our marriage. I was arranging white roses in the main foyer, roses that cost more per stem than most people earned in a day, when Diego's lieutenant, a scarred man named Raul, burst through the front doors carrying what I initially thought were red roses. It took my mind several seconds to process that the crimson staining his shirt wasn't petals, but blood. "They hit the convoy near Los Machos," Raul gasped, his words tumbling over each other in panicked Spanish.
15 of our men dead.
The Beltran Leyva people knew exactly where to find them. My husband's face transformed in that moment from the loving man who kissed me goodbye that morning into something cold and terrifying, a predator calculating his next move. The roses fell from my hands, their pristine petals scattering across marble floors that suddenly seemed stained with invisible blood. That night, Diego didn't come home until dawn. When he did, I smelled gunpowder on his clothes and saw something dead behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. He showered for an hour, the water running pink down the drain, and when he emerged, he looked at me as if seeing a stranger. "You cannot ask questions about what you see or hear in this house," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Ever. Do you understand?" I nodded, but inside, something fundamental had broken. The violence escalated rapidly after that. Our home became a fortress bristling with automatic weapons and men whose eyes held the same emptiness I'd seen in Diego's. The beautiful parties stopped. The shopping trips to Mazatlan became escorted convoys that moved like military operations through streets where ordinary people hurried indoors when they spotted our black SUVs. I learned to recognize the sound of different weapons, the sharp crack of pistols, the deeper roar of assault rifles, the distinctive whistle of grenades that sometimes echoed across Culiacan in the night. My husband began disappearing for days at a time, traveling to meetings in Tijuana, Juarez, and other border cities where territory wars raged like medieval kingdoms fighting over trade routes. When he returned, he was always a little more distant, a little more violent, a little less human. He would sit in his study for hours, staring at maps of Sonora and Chihuahua, planning routes and raids with the methodical precision of a general waging war. Sometimes I would find him there at 3 in the morning, surrounded by photographs of dead men, enemies, rivals, and occasionally, I suspected, former friends who had crossed him. The worst part wasn't the violence itself, but the way it normalized.
He learned to sleep through gunfights in the streets below our hill.
I stopped flinching when blood appeared on Diego's clothes. I became expert at pretending not to see the plastic-wrapped packages that moved through our home, or the briefcases full of American dollars that appeared and disappeared like seasonal merchandise. I was becoming complicit through silence, my soul eroding one compromise at a time until I barely recognized the woman who stared back at me from our gold-framed mirrors. By our 5th anniversary, I realized I was living with a stranger who happened to share the same name as the man I'd married. The Diego I loved existed only in my increasingly desperate memories, replaced by a cartel boss whose reputation stretched from the Pacific coast to the desert borderlands, whose enemies disappeared into mass graves, and whose love had become another form of possession, beautiful, suffocating, and ultimately deadly. The true cost of our lifestyle revealed itself gradually, like poison spreading through water. Our mansion in Culiacan became a gilded cage where every luxury came with invisible chains. The servants who called me Señora with such reverence also watched my every move, reporting back to Diego about my phone calls, my visitors, even the books I read. Privacy became a memory, replaced by the constant awareness that I was always being observed, always being judged, always one wrong word away from joining the growing list of people who had disappointed my husband.
Diego's paranoia infected everything like a virus.
He had the walls of our bedroom reinforced with steel plates after a rival cartel bombed a house in Tijuana. He installed panic rooms throughout our property, stocked with enough supplies to survive a siege, and insisted I learn to use the various weapons he kept hidden throughout our home. In this business, trust is the first thing that gets you killed, he would say, cleaning a pistol while speaking to me with the same casual tone another husband might use to discuss the weather. Even trust in your own wife. The social isolation was perhaps worse than the physical danger. Other cartel wives lived in the same beautiful prisons, but friendship among us was impossible when our husbands might be allies one day and enemies the next. I watched women I had grown close to simply vanish when their husbands fell from grace. Some fled to the United States with new identities, others weren't fortunate enough to escape before their past caught up with them. In Sinaloa, loyalty shifts like sand dunes in the desert wind, and today's friend becomes tomorrow's target. My family in Guadalajara grew distant, not entirely by choice. Diego's reputation preceded any attempt at maintaining normal relationships, and my parents learned to communicate with me through carefully coded phone calls that revealed nothing substantive about their lives or mine. My sister stopped visiting after armed men appeared at her workplace, asking casual questions about her connection to me. The message was clear: association with the wife of a cartel boss came with risks that extended far beyond the immediate family. The money that had once seemed like a blessing became a curse that followed us everywhere. Every purchase was scrutinized by federal investigators who tracked our financial movements like hunters following blood trails. We owned properties throughout Mexico, a beach house in Cancun, a ranch in Michoacan, apartments in Mexico City, but I couldn't enjoy any of them because each represented another potential trap, another place where enemies might be waiting. Even our charitable donations, which Diego made generously to churches and schools throughout Sinaloa, came under suspicion from authorities who assumed every act of generosity was a cover for money laundering. The children we had planned never came, and I began to see this as a mercy from God.
What kind of life could we offer innocent souls in our world?
I watched other cartel families struggle with the impossible choice between protecting their children and maintaining their power. Some sent their sons and daughters to boarding schools in Switzerland, creating a generation of cartel heirs who spoke perfect English and French but would inherit empires built on suffering. Others kept their families close, raising children who learned to recognize the sound of approaching helicopters before they could walk properly. As Diego's power grew, so did the target on our backs. The Mexican military began conducting raids throughout Culiacan with increasing frequency, their helicopters circling our neighborhood like mechanical vultures. Each dawn brought the possibility that today would be the day they came for us, and I learned to sleep with one ear, always listening for the sound of breaking glass or the distinctive whop-whop-whop of rotor blades that meant our time had finally run out. The transformation began in the most unlikely place, a small church in the poorest barrio of Culiacan, where the congregation couldn't afford stained glass windows or marble altars, but where the faith burned brighter than any cathedral. I had been driving aimlessly through the city, trying to escape the suffocating atmosphere of our mansion, when my car broke down just outside this humble building. While waiting for Diego's men to rescue me, I heard singing drifting through the simple wooden doors. The voices weren't professionally trained like the choir at the cathedral where we made our obligatory appearances on major holidays. These were the voices of working people, street vendors and factory workers, mothers and grandmothers who had known real hardship and found God in the midst of their struggles. Something in their singing called to a part of my soul that had been buried under years of luxury and compromise. Almost without conscious decision, I found myself walking through those doors. Father Miguel, the elderly priest who had served this community for 30 years, didn't recognize me at first. When he realized who I was, I saw no judgment in his weathered face, only the gentle sadness of a man who had seen too much suffering and still believed in redemption. "You are welcome here, daughter," he said simply, as if the wife of a cartel boss was no different from any other lost soul seeking comfort.
God sees the heart, not the address.
I began attending services secretly, slipping away during Diego's business trips to sit in the back pew and listen to sermons about forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of changing even the most hardened heart. The congregation slowly accepted my presence, though I'm sure many knew exactly who I was. In their acceptance, I found something I hadn't experienced in years: the freedom to be genuinely human, to feel genuine emotions, to confront the reality of what my life had become. Father Miguel became my confessor and spiritual guide, helping me navigate the complex moral terrain of being married to a man whose actions I couldn't control but whose lifestyle I had enabled through my silence. "God doesn't ask us to be perfect," he told me during one of our conversations after Mass. "He asks us to be authentic, to face the truth about our lives, and to choose love over fear." These words became my anchor as I began the slow process of reclaiming my soul. Through the church community, I started volunteering at a shelter for women and children fleeing domestic violence and cartel-related threats. Working with these families, I saw my own privilege from a new perspective, not as a blessing, but as a responsibility. Many of these women had suffered because of men like my husband, and here I was, living in luxury built on the same violence that had destroyed their lives. The guilt was overwhelming, but it was also cleansing, forcing me to confront truths I had spent years avoiding. Prayer became my refuge during those dark months when I was living two separate lives, the cartel wife by day and the secret believer by night. I would kneel in our mansion's chapel, surrounded by expensive religious art that Diego had acquired more for status than devotion, and pour out my heart to a God I was only beginning to truly know. I prayed for my husband's soul, for the victims of his violence, for the strength to find a way out of the moral maze that had become my existence, and for the wisdom to know what God was calling me to do. The change in me was gradual but unmistakable. I began speaking up about small things at first, questioning unnecessarily cruel decisions, suggesting alternatives to violence, refusing to participate in the social rituals that celebrated our lifestyle. Diego noticed but attributed it to stress or hormones, not realizing that his wife was undergoing a spiritual transformation that would ultimately challenge everything our marriage was built upon. The crisis came during Holy Week, when all of Mexico traditionally pauses to reflect on sacrifice and redemption. Diego had planned what he called Easter cleaning, the systematic elimination of several rivals who had been encroaching on our territory near the border. The operation would span from Tijuana to Nuevo Laredo, involving coordinated assassinations timed to coincide with the religious holidays when people would be distracted by processions and family gatherings. I overheard him discussing the details with his lieutenants in our study, their voices matter-of-fact as they planned murders like businessmen scheduling meetings. One target was a young man whose only crime was being born into a rival family. Another was a journalist from Hermosillo who had been asking too many questions about money laundering through legitimate businesses. As I listened from the hallway, my blood turned to ice water. That night, I confronted Diego in our bedroom, my newly awakened conscience finally overriding my fear. "You cannot do this during Holy Week," I pleaded, knowing even as I spoke that my appeal to religious sentiment would likely fall on deaf ears. "These are sacred days.
Have you no respect for God?"
His laugh was bitter and cold, the sound of a man who had moved so far from grace that he found faith amusing rather than threatening. "God!" he sneered, pouring himself another glass of expensive whiskey. "Where was God when I was sleeping in the streets of Badiraguato as a child? Where was God when my father was murdered by corrupt police?
God do stirulli in Sinaloa, Maria Elena. Money and bullets do.
Everything else is just pretty stories for weak people. But I was no longer weak, no longer willing to be silent. Then what does that make me? I asked, my voice stronger than I felt. What does that make us? We have built our life on suffering, Diego. Every meal we eat, every bed we sleep in, every piece of beautiful art in this house, it's all paid for with blood. How can we continue living this way? His response was swift and violent. The backhand across my face sent me sprawling across our marble floor, the same floor where I had once scattered white roses in innocent happiness. You will not speak to me about morality, he hissed, standing over me like an executioner. You have enjoyed every benefit of this lifestyle for 10 years.
You don't get to grow a conscience now, when it's convenient for you.
But something had fundamentally changed in me. The woman who would have cowered and apologized was gone, replaced by someone who had found a strength beyond physical fear. I stood up slowly, tasting blood in my mouth, and looked directly into his eyes. You're right, I said quietly. I have been complicit in this evil through my silence. But I won't be any more. I love you, Diego, but I will not help you destroy your soul completely. The next few days were the longest of my life. Diego proceeded with his Easter operation despite my pleas, but I had made my own decision. I contacted Father Miguel and arranged to meet him at a safe house the church maintained for people fleeing domestic violence. I gathered a few precious belongings, not jewelry or expensive clothes, but photographs from our early years together, my grandmother's rosary, and a small Bible that Father Miguel had given me. On Good Friday, as Diego left to oversee his Easter cleaning, I wrote him a letter that I knew might cost me my life. In it, I explained that I could no longer live as an accessory to murder, that my love for him could not overcome my love for God and human decency, and that I was leaving to save both our souls. I left the letter on his pillow next to my wedding ring, a circle of diamonds that suddenly looked like drops of blood in the afternoon sunlight streaming through our bedroom windows. Walking out of that mansion was like emerging from a tomb. Every step toward the front door felt like shedding another layer of moral compromise, another year of willful blindness. I knew I might not survive Diego's reaction to my betrayal, but I also knew that staying would mean the complete death of everything good that remained in me. I spent Easter Sunday in a safe house in a working-class neighborhood of Hermosillo, surrounded by other women who had fled violence and found refuge in faith. The contrast with previous Easter celebrations, elaborate brunches in our mansion, expensive gifts, hollow religious observances that were more social theater than spiritual practice, was stark and beautiful. Here, we celebrated the resurrection of Christ with simple food shared in genuine fellowship, prayers offered with desperate sincerity, and hope that felt as real as the desert air we breathed. Diego's reaction was everything I had feared and more. He sent men to search for me throughout Sonora and Sinaloa, offering rewards that would have made millionaires of anyone willing to betray my location. 2 women from the church who refused to give information about my whereabouts were kidnapped and held for 3 days before being released with messages that my husband wanted me home and would stop at nothing to get me back. Father Miguel was threatened directly, his small church vandalized, and several members of the congregation were harassed at their workplaces. But something unexpected happened during those terrifying weeks. Instead of abandoning me to save themselves, the church community rallied around me with a courage that put my own faith to shame. These people, who had so little to lose compared to my former luxury, risked everything to protect a woman they barely knew because they believed in redemption, in the possibility that even someone like me could be saved. Their faith became my strength when my own wavered. The breakthrough came after 6 weeks of hiding. Diego appeared at the safe house alone, without his usual entourage of armed men, looking haggard and defeated in a way I had never seen. The man who inspired terror throughout northwestern Mexico stood at the door like a lost child, holding the letter I had left him. "I read your letter every day," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand what happened to you, but I
don't want to lose you." Father Miguel, brave beyond all reason, invited Diego inside for coffee and conversation.
For 3 hours, they sat at a simple kitchen table while this elderly priest spoke to one of Mexico's most feared cartel bosses about love, redemption, and the possibility of changing even the most violent heart. I watched from the doorway as my husband, this man who commanded armies of killers, broke down and wept like a child, years of suppressed humanity finally breaking through the armor of cruelty he had built around his soul. "I don't know how to stop," Diego confessed, his tears mixing with coffee that cost less per pound than he usually spent on bullets.
I vedone things, so many things.
"How does God forgive someone like me?
How do you forgive someone like me?"
The questions hung in the air like prayers, and I realized that my leaving had accomplished something no amount of pleading or staying could have achieved. It had forced him to confront the spiritual emptiness of his existence. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Diego couldn't simply walk away from the cartel without triggering a war that would have claimed hundreds of lives, including our own. But with Father Miguel's guidance and the support of our growing faith community, we began the dangerous process of extracting ourselves from the criminal organization that had defined our lives for so long. Diego started by refusing to authorize unnecessary killings, then by redirecting cartel resources toward legitimate businesses, and finally by cooperating with authorities to dismantle the very networks he had spent decades building. Today, 7 years later, we live quietly in a small town in Arizona, where Diego manages a construction company and I teach English to immigrant children. We attend a simple Baptist church where no one asks about our past, and we spend our evenings reading scripture together and talking about the people we used to be versus the people God is still helping us become. The mansion in Culiacan was seized by the Mexican government and turned into a school. Our blood money was confiscated and distributed to victims' families, a small but necessary gesture toward the justice we can never fully restore. Some nights, I still wake up hearing gunshots that aren't really there, still feel the weight of diamond jewelry that was removed years ago, still taste the guilt that no amount of confession can completely cleanse. But I also wake up next to a man who reads his Bible every morning, who weeps when he prays for the families his former life destroyed, and who has found in God's grace the peace that all his power and money never provided. Our marriage died in that mansion in Culiacan, but from its ashes, God built something new, not perfect, but real, not wealthy, but blessed, not powerful, but finally, truly free.